Is AEW turning Rampage into an all-women's show? Are they going to rebrand it into something else? Are they going to come up with a different show for the women? The reason why this is even a topic is because today AEW dropped a video which was in collaboration with Doja Cat for one of her new songs, and essentially it had all of the women's roster in this video. And a lot of people are speculating that this could turn into what Tony Khan's important announcement is, which is potentially a all-women's show. And to be honest with you guys, I don't like this idea. I definitely don't like this idea. And it's only because AEW doing this does not feel like it's a genuine decision, right? I feel like a lot of people have been critical of AEW's women's division, not because of the roster, not because of the talent that they have, but because of how Tony Khan and AEW book women's wrestling. At one point in time, women's wrestling in AEW was really doing some great things. And then unfortunately, in the past year and a half, I would say, the women haven't been highlighted as much. And I think that's definitely been something that people are critical of, because you see what TNA does with the knockouts, you see what WWE NXT does with their women's division, and people just know that when you have a stacked roster like AEW does, you should be able to book them in meaningful ways, which I think the general consensus on the internet is that AEW really hasn't done much with them. There's always a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of start and stop pushes, a lot of matches just being made for the sake of having a match on the card. They're clearly not given that much time on TV. They're clearly not given the big storylines on TV. They're clearly just not doing much with the women's roster at all. And that's why I kind of almost feel like it's disingenuous for AEW to turn Rampage into a women's show. It almost seems like they would be doing that as like a PR move to show people, hey, we care about women's wrestling. When in reality, they've had Rampage, Collision, and Dynamite, and that's 3 shows where the women haven't really been a big part of them. Yeah, they've had some big storylines here and there once in a while, but again, it's the inconsistency that we're talking about. And I just feel like if you're Tony Khan, if you really want an all-women's show to do well, and if you really want an all-women's show to succeed and make people actually tune in, you got to have some sort of reflection of that on Dynamite, right? Their premier flagship show. And I think it's really important that people understand, like, I think AEW has a tremendous women's roster. And then I think about potential free agents and potential people that can move over to AEW, right? Like if I was Becky Lynch, just as an example, if I was Becky Lynch in WWE, and maybe I'm frustrated, and this is all hypothetical, but maybe I'm frustrated with WWE and how they do things, right? I don't know if I would turn to AEW as my primary option. And I think I think the reason for that is because I would want to go to a place where I see them doing it better than where I'm currently at. And I've been very critical of WWE and their main roster as far as how they book women. In recent weeks, we're starting to see that change with Triple H under full creative direction. However, at the same time, too, there is much more room for improvement on the main roster as well. I don't think WWE has really perfected women's wrestling, but if you look at NXT, that's probably their best example of what women's wrestling could look like. Multiple matches on a show, multiple storylines on a show, multiple storylines that don't involve the women's championship belt on the show, multiple women across the board from beginning to end. There's a big focus on the women in NXT, and I don't think WWE does that in NXT as like a PR thing. I don't think it's like Evolution. When WWE did WWE Evolution, the women's pay-per-view, that was like a PR move, right? That was kind of like, hey, we're doing this women's evolution thing, and like it's really cool. Look at us. We promote women's wrestling. NXT is not really like that. I think NXT just kind of looks at it as like, hey, we have some really talented people. We have the TV time to keep everything balanced. And it's a 2-hour show, and they figured out a way to do it. You know what I mean? And I think NXT is a great example of what women's wrestling could look like. And I think for AEW, it's weird that they don't follow the same suit. It's weird that TNA and NXT are the leading examples of this. So if I was somebody like Becky Lynch, I wouldn't even bat an eye and look at AEW. If I was Charlotte Flair, I wouldn't bat an eye and look at AEW, because when it comes to AEW, if I was in their shoes, if I was ever looking at jumping ship, the only thing I'm looking at really is the money and a lesser work schedule. But other than that, I don't think AEW books women any better than WWE has with the main roster. And even that, though, WWE's main roster, if you're watching the show, in the last 2-3 weeks, we've definitely seen a big jump of an improvement for the women's booking. So the reality is, I wouldn't want Rampage to turn into a women's show. I would want women's booking to get better across Dynamite, Rampage, and Collision. Actually build hype, build demand for an all-women's show. If you could build the demand for the all-women's show, I think people will 100% flock to it and watch it because they're invested in the women and how they're booked. I think when you do an all-women's show, which, by the way, Rampage is taped, so it's kind of like, to me, it just seems like a weird PR move. And I don't think that's what is necessary. I don't think it fixes anything for AEW. And if you have an all-women's show, I think one thing that you really have to factor in is it could potentially be an excuse for AEW to be like, well, we don't have enough TV time to put them on Dynamite anyway, so we'll just save it for Rampage. I don't know if I like that, right? Like, I feel like at that point you're creating like a little bit of a separation there, and I don't like that. Obviously, I think WWE is also a good example of not necessarily needing women's tag team championships, right? Like, I think the women's tag team championships right now with Chelsea Green and Piper Niven, definitely a lot stronger than it was. But when you looked at Ronda Rousey and Shayna and all these other women's that like had tag teams and stuff, there was no true essence of a tag team being put on TV. Like, they're not, or like a lot of the women's tag teams are just kind of forced together. And that's always kind of been an issue with WWE. But if you look at TNA, for example, Impact Wrestling's Knockouts division, they have Knockouts Tag Team Championship belts. That's a great example of what to do with the women's tag title. So I feel like AEW could learn from their competitors, but most importantly, I think AEW should kind of just focus overall on their product. I think a lot of these wrestling companies could just learn overall, like, look, this is what people are criticizing. This is what people are looking at. This is also the business portion, because you got to look at the business portion as well. But you can do a lot of these things if you just straight up listen to what the industry is demanding, And I think fans want better women's booking because there's a lot of great women talent on the card. Like, it's not like AEW doesn't have stars in their women's division, let alone if you're bringing in Mercedes Varnado. And if you're bringing Mercedes Moné, by the way, you're bringing her in. You're going to throw her on a 10 o'clock time slot on Rampage for an all-women's show? Like, that wouldn't make sense to me. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know. I feel like this is really strange. Obviously, a lot of people are speculating this could be the case. If AEW is launching an all-women's show, I think it's a silly idea. I don't think now is the time for it. But if they do go forward and actually announce this, then, best of luck to them. Hopefully it works out. I just don't see how it's really going to fix anything. And that's kind of another problem in its own that they're just giving themselves. Let me know what you guys think.